to China as part of the Columbia delegation in a relationship with Nanjing Seminary. And so Erskine was in charge of us. We rebelled and Erskine got sick. So I think he skipped 2 cities and we went to the rest of them. I'm teasing you on that. But we had a great time. But Erskine Clarke is one of those leaders of this institution really from the time he was here in the mid-60s. All the way through to when he came on the faculty, when he became really, well, you were the dean at one point at Hart, and then just has been a leader in this institution for years and years. He and Nan have retired to Montreat, where he's taken a very active role, which I'll tell you about some other time. But we are so grateful, and Erskine leads trips around what he talks about in the Southeast. He has gotten numerous awards for his most recent books, and I'd like to introduce you now Dr. Erskine Clarke, who is very much.
Thanks. Thanks. Well, it is great to be here. It's a little strange coming back, I must say, having been away for a while, and to come back and be lecturing here. Fortunately for both you and for me, there will be no exams either to take or to grade, so I'm glad about that, and I know you are as well. I appreciate very much the invitation that came from Doug and from others here, and also all of the help that has come from so many different people on the staff here. Jeff Vaughn's in the back there. I'm of the school that still believes in blackboards, so to have somebody to handle the PowerPoint and pictures for me today is a great help. So that gives you an idea of my generation. So, well, you don't need an idea of my generation. All you have to do is look here. But it is great to be here and to see some of the younger colleagues here. I'll name my, I don't want to call you my successor, but the person, because you are you, and the great gifts that William Yu brings as the new professor of American Religious History at Columbia. And it's so exciting for me to know that you're going to be, and already are and have been, involved in teaching the history of the U.S. from the particular perspective that you bring, William. So it's great to see you here, and thank you for being here. And he's actually written me to a long piece on, as I'm writing a history of Columbia Seminary right now, and so he's written and given me some very good advice about some directions I might go. My longtime colleague, Lee Carroll, is here. Lee is working with me on this book. He is a genealogist, among many, many other things. So if I want to find out who somebody's mama was, he'll find it for me, and pretty fast. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm dividing Columbia's history into 4 sections. I've got 2 hours, and so I'm going to do 2 sections in 1 hour with time for questions and attempted answers, and then the second hour will be the same format. What I'm going to do is to begin with the antebellum period and spend some time on that, and then the next period will be from the end of the Civil War until 1927, at the time that the seminary moves from Columbia, South Carolina, over to this Decatur campus. And then in the next hour, we'll begin with what I'm calling the Richards years, the years of Dr. J. McDowell Richards. In those days, in my day, as a student, we would never have thought of calling him anything other than Dr. Richards, except maybe in the dorms where we called him the little man of iron. But in contrast to today, where I can imagine all the students calling you Bill or Steve. Or so that gives some hint of some of the changes that have taken place, as well as those that Deb has mentioned. But then the last period is going to be from 1970 until the present, and we're going to try to gather together some of this forward thrust that we've already heard from Deb and Bill about some of the changes that are taking place and the way in which the seminary is facing a very new future and different future. All right, now to get started, the first thing I want to do is to say a word about who were the people that came into this part of the country who had a Presbyterian background. And the first group I would want to mention are those who came into Charleston and to Savannah, primarily Scots, Scotch-Irish, and English, who were called English dissenters. That is, they were Puritans. And those that came in to Charleston, a lot of them settled in Charleston, but then they moved south out of Charleston, south of the Stono River, and to the islands like James Island, Johns Island, Edisto Island, and then inland a little bit to places like Walterboro, Somerville, and those areas. So that would be the South Carolina side of it. And then on the Georgia side, there's Savannah, and most particularly Liberty County, Georgia. We were going to see a little bit about Liberty County, where a group of Puritans had left England in the 1630s, had gone to Massachusetts. They left Dorchester, England, went and settled in Massachusetts. They called it Dorchester, Massachusetts. Then in 1690, South Carolina was getting organized, said, we need some help. And they called on these New Englanders to come in and to settle there, and they settled in South Carolina. It was the last time, I think, South Carolinians asked for New Englanders to come in. But anyway, they came and they settled on the Ashley River, and then in 1750, they moved to what came to be called Liberty County, Georgia, and settled there, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So you have these settlers that came in at that point, but then perhaps most famously, let's see if I can do this, you had the Scotch-Irish coming in, and the Scotch-Irish, the great port of entry during the colonial period was Philadelphia, like New York was in the 19th century, and like LA has been in the 20th and early part of the 21st century, the great port of entry. Well, the Scotch-Irish came in. They came in Philadelphia there, and then as they moved west, this land in this area right here, you know, Lancaster County, a lot of Germans, Amish, Mennonites, and others settled in that area. That land was taken, and so they began to turn south. Many of them began to turn south down what was called the Great Philadelphia Wagon Road. Some went on over west through the mountains to Fort Pitt, which would become Pittsburgh. So Philadelphia and Pittsburgh will be two great centers of Presbyterianism in the north. But the Presbyterians in the south are going to follow this road that the Scotch-Irish followed right down through the Shenandoah Valley, down into the Catawba River Valley. So Mecklenburg County is going to be a great center of Presbyterianism. And then Rock Hill, David, where's David? Right here. Okay, so David's country, Rock Hill, you can see it came right there. And then Camden is often regarded as the end point, but it went on to Augusta. And this area, all this area is going to be, even today, is the stronghold of Presbyterians in the South, especially if, as these folks moved west across the Savannah River and began to settle in this area that is now known as Atlanta. So these this would be an important source of Presbyterians. Now, the other thing that we need to remember, of course, is that other people were coming in, especially to Charleston, who were coming from Africa. And they were not coming on their own, they were coming as slaves. And Charleston will represent 40% of African Americans who were brought here from either West Africa or from the Caribbean, came in at Charleston. And many, over time, over the next 100 years or so, you will see the churches, and we're going to be talking about this, where African Americans, slaves, begin to become Presbyterians and will begin to establish a very strong tradition of African American Presbyterianism, especially in this area, with its own distinct character, very, very Presbyterian, and a very strong tradition there. Now, one of the issues then, as these immigrants were coming in, is where the ministers coming from, especially with the images that Presbyterians carried about having an educated ministry. And so that was a big issue. Most of the ministers early on were educated in Great Britain. After the English Civil War, the overthrow of the Commonwealth, and the developments that followed that, if you were not an Anglican, you could not go to the two big universities in England, either Oxford or Cambridge. And so the dissenters, that is, the largely Calvinists, established dissenting academies, and out of those academies, they became more distinguished than Oxford and in the 18th century than Oxford and Cambridge, where it was primarily upper-class people who were not always interested in studying. And so, at any rate, these dissenting academies became sources for many of the Presbyterian ministers. But then the great Scottish universities did as well, particularly, well, all of them, Edinburgh, Glasgow, St. Andrews, and Aberdeen. So that was one way. But then what if you were a colonist and you wanted an education and you wanted to be a minister? It was quite a challenge to go back and to go to one of those schools. Some did, but they began to develop a pattern in this country of house schools, where someone who had some collegiate education could then go and be mentored by a local pastor. And sometimes they gathered a number of students around them, and that would be the way in which ministers during the colonial period, really up to the beginning of the 1800s, began to be prepared. But then at the beginning of the 1800s, there was a tremendous revival that began to really shake American culture and American society. It was called the Second Great Awakening. There had been a great revival during the colonial period, but this revival, that begins about 1800, will have enormous impact on American culture, not only on religious life, but also on reform movements of various sorts, on education, on women's rights, on the anti-slavery movement, on prison reform, and so on. But one of the issues was, right away, as people began to be converted, right away, and especially as they were moving west, as the frontier now is really pushing west, churches were beginning to be established, and there was a great need for ministers. In some ways, it's comparable to the situation that we see today, different, but very different, but in the sense that the churches were facing a new situation and had to think about theological education in some new ways. And so the idea of a theological seminary began to emerge and become an important image for an important reality. Now, Andover Theological Seminary was the first theological seminary that was established in this country. It's outside of Boston, and it established the pattern that would follow seminaries across the country. It's a graduate professional institution with a full-time faculty, with capital funds. We've already been hearing about that. And a campus, a library, a resident student body, a 3-year curriculum that's a post-baccalaureate curriculum, and a board of directors. Now that was the character of it. And it required a Bachelor of Arts degree. And that is, the students had to go to college first. And the reason for that was that it was believed that in order to have the necessary preparation for seminary, particularly philosophical and linguistic preparation, to get in college you had to know Latin already. And then, so students often already had Greek. They were reading the Greek classics in college. So that was the idea behind it. But also behind it was the idea that students needed to be enculturated in a certain way. They needed the manners and the good taste that was that colleges were supposed to nurture. And we may think that's rather peculiar today, but nevertheless, that was the expectation, that that would be a part of it. Now, Presbyterians in South Carolina and Georgia began to say, hey, we need a southern seminary, a southern seminary. They had been sending money up to the first seminary that had been established by the General Assembly, that is, the one that was mentioned earlier that's in New Jersey, Princeton. And so Presbyterians had been sending money up. They said, no, let's don't send the money north. Let's establish our own. So they got a board of directors together. They started looking. They decided they were going to have one. The question was, would it be in Athens, where the Presbyterians controlled the university, what was then called Franklin College. University of Georgia, believe it or not, was controlled by the Presbyterians, just like the University of North Carolina. Or Columbia, where the University of South Carolina was, South Carolina College, and they decided on Columbia. The University of South Carolina was entering a great period in its history. It was very strong. It would pass the University of Virginia. It would have a larger library than the College of New Jersey, Princeton University, and so on. So it was a logical place for them to move. And they began to think, okay, this is where we'll go. And they selected it. A group of wealthy people from Columbia, from different denominations, raised money and contributed to the establishment of the to the purchase of this building. It had been designed. This is the home of Ashley Hall. Hall was his last name. It was designed by Robert Mills, one of the early great architects in the U.S. He designed many of the buildings in Washington. His most famous building is the Washington Monument. But now he designed this very handsome home, and this is the back side of it that leads out to the garden. Notice the carriage house here, which will play an important role in the future of the seminary. You can see this is as it is today. It's been decorated as a home, but you can see the character of the building. So when people walked by or rode by, what they saw was a building that said wealth and influence. You can think of what you see. It's 3 stories, really. The first area is for the kitchen and work area. There were 2 other buildings on this property. It's 4 acres in Columbia. One building was a 1.5-story wooden building on one side, and it was for what were called the domestic servants, the slaves who worked in, who were to do the washing and cleaning and so on in the house. The other side was the same building, same type of building, 1.5-story wooden building, and it was for gardeners. So the building itself is set right in the midst of slavery. And right across from this building is this handsome home, which was owned by Wade Hampton, whose son will become, he's already one of the wealthiest men in America, and his son will become the largest single slaveholder in the South. So when students and faculty walked out of this door, that's what they saw, Wade Hampton's house. So it's very important to look at architecture and think of how does this reflect who was coming and who was supporting the seminary? Okay, now what were some of the churches that would be sending students there, and the world and the way the world looked? How did the world look if you looked out from here? Who was going there, and how would the world look? That's an important question. Well, here's some of the churches. This is that church that I described that came from Massachusetts to South Carolina to Georgia. All right, this is the single most important church in Georgia history, most influential church in Georgia history. It's the Midway Congregational Church. 7 governors out of this church. Any number of judges, generals, General Stewart, as in Fort Stewart, 50 Presbyterian ministers will come out of this church. Now, the upstairs of this church was a balcony for slaves. And again, set in this particular social and cultural setting. Notice it's a meeting house. That's very important to remember. It's a meeting house. It's very plain inside, but it has this beautiful elegance of simplicity that's inside. And the same is true of these other low country churches. This is the oldest church building in the South, Presbyterian church building in the South. It's Johns Island. And this church had enormously wealthy planters who attended this church and who helped to establish Columbia Theological Seminary. In 1860, when the war came, there were like 60 white members of this church and 600 slave members of this church. This is Edisto Island, same thing, very important for Columbia's history. This is a beautiful, beautiful church with a very hard history in terms of the African Americans who went there. There's a very strong African American church now right down the road from this. But at any rate, this is another example. This is another group that came in and went up the Black River north of Charleston, established farms, Scottish people, and they built a series of churches. Now look at that church and what it conveys. It conveys strength and wealth and influence, and in fact, that's what it was. Many ministers would come out of this church. In 1860, it would have right at 100 white members and 610 members. Second Presbyterian in Charleston would be the single most influential church on Columbia, on Columbia's history, and there it is. Independent church in Savannah, one of the most beautiful churches, I think, in the country. But again, you can see. Now, these are the churches and the background that that helped in the forming. It's out of these churches. It's out of people who are in the planter and business classes primarily that will help in the forming. But you will also begin to have, oh, this is the inside of this pulpit. This is Independent Church in Savannah. That pulpit, you think they need a oxygen mask to fall down when you get up in it. It's so high above the rest. It's just spectacular on the inside. Very, very beautiful. But then you have the upcountry where those Scotch-Irish were coming in. And you can see this is the original building. Again, that meeting house style. This is the old stone church, right? It was built, you can tell it was a frontier church. This is right outside of Clemson. So you would begin to have people coming in from there. Now, the faculty at Columbia, the most influential faculty member was George Howe. He taught at Dartmouth. He came south for his health. He liked the South. He stayed in Columbia. He was a great scholar of the Old Testament and stayed and really was the founder. There was an earlier founder named Goulding, who those of you from Columbus know was the one who actually organized the seminary. But this is the man who spent so many years here at George Howe. And another faculty member I want to mention, Charles C. Jones. I've spent some time, this is a book of mine that came out a few years ago, but it's about Jones. And he was known as the apostle to the Negro slaves by whites. And he was, again, he represented a kind of Presbyterian approach to the question of slavery. He didn't challenge the system, but he tried to make the system more humane in a variety of ways. And he was greatly admired for that throughout the country. Now, board members, this is William Seabrook on his plantation on Edisto Island. Seabrook, one of the great planters on the coast, quite a remarkable man. He also gave the first endowment for Columbia. It's an extraordinarily beautiful plantation. It's now owned by the Dodge family, as in the Autos. Now, this is a slave family from Edisto Island. The wealth that built Columbia Seminary was largely drawn from the labors and the sorrows and the actual physical bodies of people like these men and women and children. This is a picture right in the middle of the Civil War. And another picture from Edisto Island. And we need to remember that, like other institutions all across the eastern seaboard are discovering, that slavery provided much of the wealth that built these institutions and that allowed them to thrive. Now, the picture that I showed of Howe, the first faculty member, and Jones, Howe, one of the reasons he liked staying in the South was that he married a woman who was a member of that Midway church. And her father was one of the wealthiest slave owners in the South. And she had inherited herself some 70 slaves. And so this New Englander suddenly was a slave master. This founder of Columbia Seminary had about 70 slaves. And Jones ended up with 3 plantations and about 130 slaves. So they were deeply immersed in the system of slavery, even though they also were regarded widely as the most progressive, the most benevolent, the ones who were best known for the ways in which they tried to be paternalistic masters, and to ensure that slaves were treated well, but treated as slaves. Students, two students to highlight. This remarkable couple is in this book that came out of mine last year. The single most important missionaries in West Africa, American missionaries in West Africa during the first half of the 19th century, freed their slaves, very, very wealthy families, freed their slaves and helped them to get to West Africa themselves after giving them choice of going north or going to what is today Liberia, and fought the international slave trade and fought the degrading images that Europeans and European Americans had of Africans and their descendants, and they fought that vigorously. Benjamin Morgan Palmer grew up in Walterboro, South Carolina, brilliant preacher, theologian, and first moderator of the Presbyterian Church in the Confederate States of America. So these were some of the students that graduated. Now, what were some of the purpose? What was the primary purpose of a theological education in this setting in the South, a Southern theological seminary, located in those buildings, with people coming out of this background with these interests that they brought with them, the natural interests and concerns and world views, perspectives that they brought with them. They were to be, in the words of Brooks Hollifield, they were to be gentlemen theologians. They were to be gentlemen. Remember, they had to have that college education, but they were to be gentlemen nevertheless. And many of them came from these very, not all of them by any means, but many of them came from very wealthy families, so that they felt at ease going across the street and visiting with the Wade Hampton family or the Preston family that later bought that house, the Senator's family that later bought that house. And what was expected of them was that they were to be both pious, that is, deeply committed Christians who'd had some important conversion experience at some part of their adult life, who were also deeply learned. So my Presbytery of Charleston Atlantic, when it was Charleston Presbytery, in 1850, when the ordination exams, students first of all had to turn in a paper in Latin on some theological theme. Then they had to turn in a paper on exegesis in Hebrew and an exegesis in Greek. And then they were examined not only in theology, but also in things like astronomy and geology and a wide variety. They had to be gentlemen. It was still in a day when everything wasn't just governed by experts. So gentlemen theologians. Now the great teacher of this period and the single most influential teacher in Columbia's history was James Henley Thornwell. He left the presidency of Columbia, of the University of South Carolina, to be professor of theology at Columbia, and he'd already been on the board for years. People are still writing very important books and studies on Thornwell. Now, one of the things about Thornwell that is important for Presbyterianism and very important in Columbia's history was his attempt to find a middle way between extremes. Presbyterians get nervous when people start going too far to the right or too far to the left. Presbyterians like to be right in the middle. And the reason they like to be in the middle, there are a lot of reasons they like to be in the middle, But one reason they like to be in the middle is that they think that you get into trouble if you go too far to the right or too far to the left. And that wisdom resides in the middle. It's not just practical. You know, it's try to find some practical compromise. But really, wisdom is in the middle. So that is very, very Presbyterian, and it is very Columbia Seminary. It has marked Columbia Seminary over most of its history. They get real nervous, too far one side or the other. Now, a couple of quick pictures. When Jeff was looking at this, he said, they all look alike. Well, they were alike. It's not a very good picture, but if you looked at their faces, you would see that, in fact, they do show some differences. But that's the class of 1861. I found the diary of one of them at the time, Fort Sumter. They were very interested in what was going on. I mean, the students were quite taken by what was happening in Charleston and going on. Now, let's see, I think, yes. Okay, this is First Church, Augusta, and the first meeting of the Presbyterian Church in the Confederate States of America was held here. And the moderator was Benjamin Morgan Palmer, as I said. The leading spirit was Thornwell. John Leighton Wilson, this missionary to West Africa, he had come back. He was a leading spirit as well. And Charles Calcutt Jones, the apostle to the Negro slaves, he was there. Columbia Seminary dominated overwhelmingly the leadership and the presence at the first meeting of the General Assembly of what would come to be called the Presbyterian Church in the South. Okay, some themes for this period. First, it's a Southern seminary. I hope that's clear. Its social and physical location, as well as its theological tradition, shaped its character. So you have this theological, it's Calvinist, it's very Calvinist, but its physical location, that building that it was in, and its social location shaped its character. Second, it was a part of a slave society. The financial resources, as I said, for the seminary were drawn primarily from the labors and sorrows and the actual bodies of slaves. When the board, this was in pre-bank day, there were some banks around, but the board, how does it invest its money? It would loan money to planters, and for security for that, they would accept the names of slaves. So slaves served as security on loans to the planters. So another way, it was immersed in that particular culture. Its purpose, as I've said, was to nurture gentlemen theologians who were both pious and learned. And its ethos, its culture, was marked by this quest for a middle way. Okay, now I want to turn to the next period in Columbia's history, this period from the end of the war until the seminary moves to Columbia. That's Atlanta, a part of Atlanta, downtown Atlanta, after Sherman had left. You can see this is the rail yard down. It's not too far, actually, from Central Presbyterian Church downtown. But that gives you, it was massive destruction in Atlanta, massive destruction. This is Charleston. This church was a very important, the first president of the board was the pastor of the Circular Congregational Church. It was designed as well by Robert Mills. It was the most influential church in the city in terms of political leadership for several generations. Very wealthy, but now you see what it looks like. This is Circular Congregational Church on Meeting Street. There's a church there now. It's not anything the same size. It was built after the Civil War. This is another view of Charleston. All right, this is a view of Columbia, looking down Main Street. After Sherman's troops had left, the seminary is back several blocks, and it was not burned. Arsenal Hill, those of you that know Columbia, Arsenal Hill over where the governor's mansion is, was burned, and the home of Agnes Law, whose family she and her husband had given the first dorm, Law Hall, at Columbia. And her home, three-story home with the library of John Adger, one of the great professors here, it was burned, and she ended up living out the rest of her life in the dorm at Columbia Seminary. That's a picture of John Adger. He came from one of the wealthiest families in the country, the Adgers in Charleston. Had been a missionary in what is today Turkey to the Armenians, and was really a very strong and important early professor. Now, one of the first questions that Columbia people had to face was, well, first of all, there was this devastation, the physical devastation that you see. There were also this enormous loss of life. Second Church, Charleston, that I said was the most important congregation during the antebellum period for Columbia, they lost 27 sons out of a congregation of about 250 whites. And they have on the plaque on their door, on the right as you go into the door there, this plaque listing these 27 young men who died for their country while in the service of the Confederate States, 1860, 1865. And that tells a lot. They died for their country, the Confederate States of America. Now, the question they had to face, though, was what to make of the war. How do you understand this war? They had been praying and praying for the establishment of the Confederate States of America. It was a huge theological issue that Columbia faculty and Columbia graduates tried to wrestle with. John Jones had been from this very wealthy family in Liberty County, who was a pastor at this time, at the end of the war, of the Presbyterian Church in Marietta. He wrote in some letters, he said, "Let us daily," this was as the war was still going on, as Atlanta was being sieged, "Let us daily and hourly commit our cause, ourselves, our all to him who doth all things well. Surely we are not to be overwhelmed in utter ruin, poverty, and disgrace." And then when the Yankees had come storming across Georgia in this famous march to the sea, the pastor of Central Presbyterian Church, who was also from Liberty County, Robert Mallard, he stayed behind in Atlanta. His wife was able, and children and servants were able to get on the train, one of the last trains out to Augusta. She fell and broke her arm. Then she got down to her home in Liberty County, and when Sherman reached there, and while they came onto the plantation and were ransacking the plantation, she was in labor for a child that survived. Now, he wrote that one of the distressing effects on him was the temptation to think hard of providence. "I know," he said, "that what God does is and must be right, but when I see a cruel and wicked foe prospering and penetrating farther and farther into the very vitals of our country, and notice our country. And when the prayers of God's people seem utterly fruitless in arresting them, I am perplexed. And were I to listen to the tempter, I would be disposed to question the utility of prayer, at least for this objective. But then when defeat had finally come, John Jones up in Marietta wrote this. The hard truth must be faced. He confessed that however we may be able to prove the wickedness of our enemies, we must acknowledge that the providence of God has decided against us in this tremendous struggle we have just made for property rights and country. The hand of the Lord is upon us. And he prayed for grace to be humble and behave aright before him until these calamities be overpassed. So I've taken the time to read those because it sets the tone of struggle and that's going to mark this sense of defeat, of loss, of bitterness is going to mark, and defensiveness is going to mark not only the South but also much of the culture of Columbia Seminary. Now the person who, gotten a little ahead of my story here. His picture will come up in a moment. The person who will set out the strategy for living through these days with this, and what he was he said, look, it was John Lafayette Girardeau, and he'd been a chaplain in the Army. He'd seen all of the terrible loss, the suffering. He'd been before Petersburg and in the trenches there. And anyway, it's a fascinating story of his background. He'd been a great preacher to blacks and built a huge church for blacks in Charleston before the war. But he was an unconverted Confederate after the war. And he said, how are we to resist this Yankee imperialism, this cultural imperialism? He asked, was the war fought in vain? Yes, he said. He's preaching when they're bringing the bodies of the Confederate dead from Gettysburg back to be reinterred at Magnolia Cemetery in Charleston. He said, did all of these young men, did they die in vain? Yes, he said. In terms of we were unable to establish our own country. But they will not have died in vain if we keep the faith. And if we continue to teach our children using language, the phraseology of the past, to teach truth that is eternal, truth that we advocated before the war. And John Adger would say, we lost the war, it was against God's providence, but on slavery we were right. So you have this commitment, this defensiveness, and how are we going to defend? How are we going to defend a Southern culture? By the way we teach our children and by using language as a primary conveyor of values. So, just as an example, when you talk of the South, you don't mean everybody that lives in the South. You mean the white South. When you think of the South, the white South. So, there was this very strong defensive position. Okay, there were other aspects to this period, and this man whose picture is coming up next is a great example of what was happening at Columbia. James Woodrow received a PhD from Heidelberg in biology, a great scientist, the uncle of Woodrow Wilson. His brother, Woodrow Wilson's father, was on the Columbia faculty as well. He, a planter, a judge in Mississippi, gave in 1859 a huge endowment. It was so much larger than anything. It was probably the largest. I've not checked this, but I don't think Princeton had as large an endowment as this one, this named endowment. and it was on the relationship of science to the Bible. That was what the chair was about. So what happens? Everybody's thinking, you know, this is a natural relationship. It's a good relationship between the two. Then Darwin comes along, and that changes everything. And so he accepts a type of Darwinism. He thinks he's very orthodox in everything, but he accepts evolution. And he ends up being finally forced out of his chair at Columbia. And he's also very wealthy and well-traveled. I stayed in a B&B. I was doing something in Marietta, and I stayed at this big B&B right across the street from the Marietta Presbyterian Church. It's like, I can't remember. It was about 8,000 square feet. Anyway, it was his summer home. I just discovered it when I was there. It was James Woodrow's summer home. I mean, I can't imagine going to Marietta to get out, you know, get to a cool place. But if you lived in Columbia, then that would make sense, I guess. But at any rate, Woodrow is forced out. He goes down the street and becomes the president of the University of South Carolina, and the faculty votes. Students can take any course they want at the University of South Carolina, except with this guy who's just been on the faculty at Columbia. Well, he's later honored. He becomes the moderator of the Senate of South Carolina and so on. It's a very interesting story. But this man, after Thornwell, this man, John Lafayette Girardeau, will be the most influential theologian that Columbia produces for 150 years. Very influential today among very, very, very conservative people. So he represents what is really a shrinking of an earlier world. These lean years is not only shrinking in terms of finance, but shrinking in terms of outlook and spirit. And so that is a part of it. Now this is a picture of the campus about 1870. Now notice the two dorms. I also noticed this building. This is a carriage house that was turned into the chapel. Winthrop College was started there, but it's also the place where Woodrow Wilson said he was born again for eternity. That is, he had some conversion experience in the Columbia Seminary Chapel. I used to say he was probably the last one, but maybe not. But at any rate, that's what the campus looked like. This is about this is the early 20th century. This is all of the students lined up. Again, they look a lot alike, but faculty right in the middle. Notice in particular that guy. I'll show you his picture later, but that's another picture. Now, this is a picture of 1925 class. You might recognize someone in here from your childhood. I don't know whether the hay is that one of your ancestors? Okay. The Hayes are related to a substantial part of the Presbyterian Church, so it's not unusual to see a relative there. All right. Now the themes, and then I want to see what questions you have. Themes of this. Oh, one more picture. Okay, you get this restricted view. These are lean years. Financially, it's lean in terms of the richness of thought in contrast to the earlier years. People today are reading Thornwell. Nobody except very, very few, very, very, very conservative people are reading Girardeau. So they're lean years, but it's also years when white Southerners become more Southern than ever before. This new identity as Southerners. It's also the time when what we used to call the cousin system, well, we just pointed to the Hayes being related to everybody. I mean, this was this kind of interlocking system of families that were, and they, if I had the time, I could really show you a lot about that, but I don't have the time to do that. So there's that side. Then, so I want to conclude this period with these observations. It's marked by the poverty of the region and of the seminary. It's a move from personal experience of a broader world. Those early antebellum folks were well-traveled. All the faculty spent time in Europe. They visited churches there. They were in conversation with European theologians and so on. All of that vanishes pretty much after the Civil War. People didn't have the money. So it's much more restricted. It's much more provincial for both faculty and students. Third, a deeply informed and lively theological tradition enters a much more feeble and restricted life. And fourth, as I said, it becomes more southern than ever before. This cousin system begins to dominate. And the seminary attempts to support what used to be called a southern way of life, which meant, of course, Jim Crow. And the social arrangements connected with this. And it was supporting our kind of people. Now, what were our, well, you saw the pictures, our kind of people. All right. Whoa. I feel like I've been on an express train. Let's see what questions you have, and then we will, take our break.
I have so enjoyed this, Dr. Clarke. Question that I have written down, how did, I mean, not only the Presbyterians of the South, but Christians of all denominations, did they like cherry pick and become like a Jeffersonian Bible to like choose maybe verses and twist around to justify, you know, to make peace within themselves theologically from a Christian standpoint for property rights, for economic sustenance, you know, the patron, all this in quotes, for the justification of the whole slavery system? I mean, is this something, a common thread, not only the Presbyterian Church?
Yeah, it was. It was. The Presbyterians, though, because the Presbyterians represented the strongest intellectual tradition in the South. The Episcopalians had some real, and other denominations as well, but without question, the Presbyterians, they controlled the universities pretty much. And like South Carolina, after a little period of wandering in the wilderness of Jeffersonian deism, came back with Thornwell. But the Presbyterians were the dominant group. And you see that, I mean, not just, you see that with intellectual historians of the South will point to that as well.
But do they have like their version of the Jeffersonian Bible? I mean, not the Jeffersonian Bible that he cut and pasted, but I mean to justify, it's just awful atrocities, the Jim Crow, the whole...
Well, they're opposing that. I mean, they fight that.
But they still have slaves that they married into or whatever.
Yeah, yeah. It's complicated. History is full of ironies. Sam.
My great-grandfather was a pastor of the church in Camden, South Carolina.
Yeah.
He said Samuel Hudson Hay, he was an ardent secessionist. And in the history of that church, he kind of had to flee from Sherman because of being an ardent secessionist.
Yeah.
You know, he was on the run from somewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of people were. Yeah, and that area right here. This,
I mean, Christian.
Yeah, yeah. A man from the Mount Zion Church out in the country near Maysville had the prayer at the, who was a minister from there, had the prayer at the convention for seceding. Yeah, so that was it. Yes?
How was the Presbyterian Church in Virginia at this time. Was the Church of England still very strong?
Yes, the Presbyterian Church in Virginia was very, I mean, it was one of the strong areas of Presbyterianism, no question, especially in the valleys of Virginia. No question about that. Union Seminary had not yet blossomed like it's going to during the antebellum period. It had not. It begins, once it moves from Hampton-Sydney to Richmond, then it begins to become, and Richmond recovers much more quickly and is a much more vibrant city than Columbia, for example, just so that
Had the Confederacy of Richmond was the capital of.
yeah. But after the war, Richmond is going to recover. The rise of tobacco and so on will make, help that. Yeah.
You mentioned the large gift that was basically for science.
Yes.
What was the purpose of bringing that in? I'm trying to figure out.
Yeah,
how that fits
yeah.
into the overall.
Right. Okay. People before Darwin, basically, and there had been an earlier period where there were strong questions about science relationship to religion, but that had pretty much been settled by the beginning of the 18th century, the beginning of the 1800s. And so people thought that if you looked at science, if you looked at the heavens, they declare the glory of God. So there is a congruence between theology and science. They both teach about the wonders of God, and you can learn something from science. This was what was believed. You can see God's handiwork in science. And so people thought that. And so this judge in Mississippi said, hey, this is he didn't say hey, but he said, this is worth supporting. And he gave this huge endowment for it. And then Darwin came, and Darwin challenges not so much, well, he did the beginning question, but the big question for Darwin, the big question that Darwin raises is about the end, about what to use a big word, the teleology. Is history moving toward a goal, which is what Christians say, and what people had believed, like who were not Christians, but who believed, that there was progress, that even Marx believed that there was a certain march of history. So what Darwin does is says, no, there's no goal out there. History is moving by chance. And so it's not as though the eye is created in order to see, that there's something out there called seeing that pulls the development of the eye. It's just by selection, natural selection, that happens. So it's a huge challenge, and that's when science and religion really break apart for so many people. Now, not for James Woodrow, the man that I pointed to, but for many others. Okay, you have been very patient going through this period, and let's take a break and get some coffee, whatever else you need. So,
we're starting at 10:45.
Okay, all right, good. Okay.